So I'm so excited to welcome Victoria Blanco, who's both a writer and researcher I admire and a dear friend. I'm lucky enough to have known Victoria for more than 10 years now, which is wild to say, since our MFA program together at the University of Minnesota. So I got to watch this book develop firsthand over a long period of time. And I saw her passion and commitment firsthand. As I, read and heard her careful, gorgeous prose that chronicles the lives of the Rarámuri family she spent months and years living and working beside. Out of the Sierra, which is the book here, is both an intimate and sweeping book. It's the product of 14 plus years of participatory field research and oral history interviews with an indigenous Rara community. I'm sorry, I always trip over this word, so apologies. Community displaced from their homes in the Sierra Madre due to climate change, environmental degradation, and drug violence, and resettled in a government-funded indigenous settlement in Chihuahua City, Mexico. The book follows the story of the Gutierrez family as they make the difficult decision to leave their ancestral home in the mountains, settle in El Oasis, and navigate the challenges of a harsh urban landscape and punishing capitalist economy while resisting assimilation and working to maintain their cultural identity. When I sat down to read Out of the Sierra, I knew it would be beautiful, sensitive, and enlightening. I didn't expect that it would also be completely riveting and immersive, and that I would find myself stretching my morning coffee through another chapter and another to find out how these people who I'd come to know through Victoria's writing, Lupita and Martina and Luis and Jaime and Manolo and others, would continue to resist, compromise, and find meaning amidst and in the face of violent capitalism and racism that sought to erase their people. In this context, even the small choices, as Victoria will be talking about, whether to celebrate a child's birthday, whether to spend an afternoon sewing instead of earning desperately needed money, or whether to hold a banner at a community celebration, become acts of negotiation. Underneath all of these choices lies the cultural practice of korima, a guiding principle of reciprocity, of care for people and land, that the Rarámuri people must adapt to these urban environments. And Victoria will tell us more about that. Some of my students are here today. I'm so glad to see them. We've been reading Out of the Sierra, and oh, they're nodding along. And they've been moved and riveted as I have. I'm so excited for them and for all of you to sort of see how Victoria brings the lens of history, the methods of anthropology, the doggedness of journalism, and the prose of a novelist together to craft such an urgent and compelling book. So I'll wrap up because the point is to hear from her, not me. But before I do, just a few words about her accomplishments. Victoria's writing and research has been supported by a Fulbright Award, a Jerome Hill Artist Fellowship, the Ellen Malloy Desert Writers Award, and the Digital Borderlands Grant from the University of Arizona, among others. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Guernica, Literary Hub, and Catapult, among others. Out of the Sierra was named a 2025 ALA Notable Title, an Indies Introduced Title, and a 2024 Editor's Choice Title. And the books will be for sale at the end, so encourage you to maybe get one, ask Victoria to sign it. They're also like fun and bright on your bookshelf. So, and with that, no further ado.
Yeah, go ahead, of course.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Emily, for introducing Victoria's book. In addition to the book selling session at the end, we will be raffling 3 copies of her books today. So put your name on this list and we will draw.
This on. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Yes. Oh, okay, perfect. Hi, everybody. Just a quick mic check. Can everybody hear me fine? Okay, perfect. If at some point you can't, because it might move, just raise your hand and let me know. Thank you very much to the Hot Cunningham lecture series for having me today here. Thank you so much, Emily, for facilitating the introduction and for welcoming me to Boston. I've never been here. It's a city I've long wanted to visit, so I'm just super happy to be here for all those reasons and to speak to you today about manifestations of korima on the US Mexico borderlands. So I'll start us off with one of my favorite stories to tell. A few years ago, I think it was about 5 years ago, I was in Chihuahua for field work. I've been doing field work there for 15 years. I started pretty soon after undergraduate, and I've just kept going back about once a year. And so during this trip, I was there, and it was a beautiful desert evening in the summer. And as is typical in El Oasis, the name of the community where about 500 displaced Rarámuri live and is the subject of my book, dozens of women were preparing for one of their nightly foot races. Let me actually do this next. So during the foot races in Rarámuri culture, there's also this betting process, because why not? But instead of betting money, Rarámuri women typically bet dresses. And so the dress betting process goes like this. If I'm wearing a dress that you like, you might approach me and say, "Oh, Victoria, I love that dress. I want it. I want to bet against you. Do you like my dress?" And if I say, "Okay, yeah, I like your dress. I'm willing to put mine up for the bet." And then if I win, I get both dresses. If you win, you get both dresses. So this is a process that happens almost every night, especially in the warmer summer months. Here in the photograph, you can see Paula Olguin matching two dresses to go together. So she's going to tie them together here, and then she's going to add them to that growing pile. And so the betting process can take several hours. You'll have this like small mountain of skirts and blouses and children that run and fall into it, and it's a lot of fun. And at the end of the night, when the race is over, the winners get to come and they get to take their dresses. And then the ones that don't win, the losers, don't get anything that time. Now, over the years, I've participated in the betting process multiple times. I've sewn my own dresses and put them into the betting pile. I've won, I've lost. I don't like losing. It doesn't feel good. Not my favorite thing. So, I got curious at one point about other women's perception of winning and losing. And one of my favorite responses that I've gotten, and it tracks with what dozens of other women have said to me when I ask, what does it feel like to lose? The response this one woman gave me was, "A rato vuelve," which translates to, "It'll come back later, a rato, at some point. It'll come back." And so I love that response because I think it perfectly encapsulates the spirit of korima. Korima being their people's word for reciprocity. Korima being the idea that you give into the world and you will get a return simply because you give, simply because you are part of the world and you exist. The world will take care of you. You might not get it back in that exact moment. It's not a transaction. You might get a return later at some unknown point in time. A rato. It's not a definitive word in Spanish. And so I just love that response so much because it's so short and it encapsulates so much of what korima is. Now, korima obviously relies on trust in the world, but what is the world in Rarámuri culture? In Rarámuri culture, the world encompasses relationship with one another, relationship with the natural environment, with the land, and relationship with Onoruame, who created the world. And it's such an integral part of how Rarámuri people understand their place in the world, that it's woven into their own origin story. And so I'll take a minute now and I'll read you the origin story, which actually starts the book off. In the beginning, the sun and the moon lived together in a cave. The moon, content in the dark, wanted for nothing. The sun, who loves spreading light across the earth, desired more beauty. Blending corn and clay, the sun created a Rarámuri man. The sun made the man's skin the color of earth to remind him he would always be connected to the land. To animate him, the sun blew 3 gusts of wind into the figure and brought the man to life. Overjoyed by his creation, the sun made another figure, this one a woman. Into her, he blew 4 heavy gusts of air, giving her the strength to birth Rarámuri children. The Rarámuri man and woman took care of the earth as the sun had wanted, planting corn, weaving baskets made of grass, and fishing in the lakes and streams. They had children who joined them in planting and harvesting. Each day, the Rarámuri families, which soon numbered many, gave thanks to the sun, whom they called Onoruame, for giving them life. And so historically, the Rarámuri people have their origin story, but something that I wanted to do in my book was make space to hold multiple accounts of history. So I also narrate in the book the story of colonization, and I'll tell you a bit now about how the Rarámuri people came to live in the Sierra and then came to leave the Sierra. So in the 1500s, when Spanish colonizers arrived to the Chihuahuan Desert, Rarámuri people lived in the desert and made their lives there. And then as the invasion just gained strength, their people realized that their best chance for survival was actually to retreat. So they left to the mountains of Western Mexico, and they spread out around the mountains. The Western Sierra, you can imagine it as something like the Grand Canyon. It's an expansive network of canyons and gorges that run for miles deep. Rather than build communities that could easily be found and destroyed by the colonizers who soon began to follow, their people dispersed around the land. And so for centuries, they lived just with their families in homes that they built, or sometimes in caves, and they lived by farming the land. Now, the land in the Sierra is very difficult to cultivate. It's a semi-arid landscape. There's a lot of crop failure. This has been true for centuries. And so to help ensure their survival, their people developed one manifestation of korima at that point, and that was to run and deliver food to each other across the network of canyons. You may have heard already about the Rarámuri people, who are more commonly known as the Tarumaras, for being expert marathon runners. I think this has been popularized in the media over the last 20 or so years. And the running actually was born out of necessity. People lived and still do live in what they call their rancherias. There's very small plots of land, and they live sometimes up to 2 days away, running, not walking, from the nearest neighbor. And so if one family over here is experiencing a pretty good harvest that year, but they know that the rain didn't arrive to the family that lives 2 days away over here, under korima, they are obligated to run to each other and to share what they have, even if it is very little. And it is through this practice that their people have been able to maintain cultural autonomy and take care of each other over 500 years. Now, over the centuries, there have been other incursions into the Sierra. There have been loggers in the 19th century that come in to cut down the pine forests. There was a railroad that was built running through the Sierra. And then more recently, in the last few decades, there have been drug growers who infiltrate the Sierra to find secluded spaces to grow the marijuana and poppies that, eventually make their way as final products to the United States. And so it's this combination of factors that have led more than half of their people, about 40,000 of their people, to leave the Sierra and to come to the cities, the nearby cities in the state. Those would be Chihuahua City, where I have conducted my field research, and then a few hours north is Ciudad Juárez, which sits on the border with Texas. And so now we're at this point where people are coming out of the Sierra, and it's a very difficult decision for people to make to leave the Sierra because their origin story tells them that the Sierra was made for them. They are bound by Onorwame to stay in the Sierra and take care of the land and take care of each other. What happens when that becomes impossible? Families like the Gutierrez family, who I profile in the book, often make the decision to leave because their children are starving to death. And so we find ourselves now in El Oasis, a compound funded by the government, the state government, that hosts about 500 people. During my field research, I noted that a lot of Rarámuri people will seek out spaces in the city that are natural. Chihuahua City is a typical city. It's a lot of concrete, it's roads, it's cars, it's smog, it's all of that. But in the desert, you do have these natural spaces called arroyos, which are these natural canyons that the desert has that tend to hold floodwaters. And there's one right behind the compound. And so here is a picture of a bunch of children in an oasis spending time in the arroyo. There's actual trees in there. Sometimes there's a little river that runs through it during the rainy months. And I just love that also as a form of resistance, to not congregate in the streets, to not congregate in the shopping malls, to not go to the places that the city has to offer, but to seek out these natural spaces and make them their own. So how did I get connected with the Rarámuri people? I grew up in El Paso, Texas, in a family that's been in the borderlands for about 5 generations. And every week, almost every week growing up, my mother would put me and my 2 brothers into the minivan, and we'd go across the border to Ciudad Juárez to visit my uncle. And it was there on excursions to restaurants for lunch, to the panaderia, just taking a walk around the neighborhood, that I would encounter Rarámuri people. And this was always in the form of women in their bright floral dresses coming up to me or to my mother and extending their hands and saying, korima. My mom taught me that that word means limosna or alms. And she taught me that it was very important to give some amount of money to them because they didn't have money and they were struggling to eat on a daily basis. So for the first 2 decades of my life, that was my understanding of who the Rarámuri people were. I just understood that they were people who shared the space with me, who dressed in really bright, beautiful, colorful dresses that I admired, and nothing more. And it wasn't until I was an undergraduate studying history, studying creative writing, studying anthropology, that I had wonderful professors who guided me in asking deeper questions about my home, guided me in asking, who are the people that share this home to me? What is their history? How does my history and my story and my understanding of who I am intersect and deviate from them? And that is how I started my field research. And so over time, I began documenting instances of what I came to understand as resistance to assimilation into mainstream Mexican culture. And that resistance is tied very intimately with korima. And so one of the manifestations of korima is the dresses themselves, I've come to learn. Rarámuri women resist blending in with the jeans and the dresses that we wear, what we're supposed to wear in order to get a job, to go to class, to be considered, dressing for success. They won't do it. And so they hand sew their dresses, and usually in very bright floral patterns. And And this is very common throughout the cities. Now, another thing that I have observed over the years, and although I didn't get too much of a sense of this as a child, I saw it in my field work. Rarámuri women are punished and harassed every single day for wearing their dresses out in public. People insult them, throw trash at them, horrendous things. And yet they still continue to wear them. Why? If you ask them, it's because they want to stand out against the gray landscape of the desert and the blue jeans. And so they'll on purpose choose the brightest, most floral fabrics that you can imagine. And so here we have Kuka in a really beautiful bright red and green dress. And you'll notice also in the photos that all of the women have this piping along the skirts. In this instance, it's a neon green piping. The piping is done in contrast to the rest of the dress because it actually represents their people's story of leaving the Sierra. The piping is the path that people follow out of the Sierra and into the city. It's a circle around the skirt because it symbolizes korima, it symbolizes reciprocity, it symbolizes the giving and the return. And so onto the dresses themselves, what mestizos might see as a backwardness and a refusal to assimilate, the Rarámuri women actually see their story as continuing despite their displacement. Yes, and I'll show you in another picture in a few minutes, but another design element that they incorporate is little triangles above the piping. Those triangles represent the mountains. Yeah. So once again, their story of leaving and of returning and of connection with the land is stitched onto their dresses, and it is extremely important to them in order to be able to wear those dresses every day and just be visible. It is a protest. It is reclaiming identity, and it is reclaiming the desert. I find it to be incredibly powerful, especially because it is so quiet, really. Another manifestation of korima on the US Mexico borderlands actually has to do with the production of the dresses. The dresses themselves traditionally are hand sewn. Here you can see Maria Ligia working on a dress by hand. The dresses themselves can take weeks to complete. I've made them myself. I get made fun of consistently because it takes them 3 weeks. It takes me 8 weeks. So even after all these years, my sewing skills are not what they should be, I'm told, but I get it done eventually. And one of the another means of resistance. So I'll tell another story. Some years ago, about 5 years ago, the government in Chihuahua decided that they would bring in sewing machines into the community and teach the women to sew on the machines. And they managed to secure, on behalf of the community, a contract with the local hospital to make bed sheets. And so the hospital ordered hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bed sheets. And the Rarámuri women were told that, hey, this is a paying job. This is a job that you can do quickly on the sewing machines. It's a job that you can do within the community, which means that you don't have to go out and be exposed to the harassment that you receive every day. And it's a job where your children can be around you because they love to have their children with them. They don't do daycares. So wherever they go, their young children go with them. And you would, it sounds good, right? It sounds like a good opportunity. Shouldn't have been surprised, but I was a bit surprised when only 5 women agreed to be trained on the sewing machines. The rest of the women said, no, absolutely not. We're not doing this. Speed ahead just a little bit. I wanted to show you this one. So here is a picture of the women here on the right are working on the sewing machines inside a sewing workshop that the government built within the community. the women who decided not to participate in this project did so because it is too severe of a break in korima. They didn't want to break up the sewing circles. The sewing circles are spaces where they can gather to laugh, to share news, to talk, to watch their children play while they work on their dresses. Here you see the women in something more like an assembly line. They're not facing each other. There's no opportunity really to speak. The sewing machines are a little bit loud. There's a constant whirring sound, so they can't really speak to one another. These women typically work in silence all day long, making the bed sheets. And so it's just, there was my answer as to why, why they didn't want to do it, because they would lose this, what's happening on the left, the convening of people to sit and make the dresses, to share news, just to have fun. And so I'll read from you now a little bit about what that feels like. With such a great need for coins, the woman could have sacrificed sewing in order to spend time going and asking for korima. The morning hours when the children were in school saw plenty of traffic in the main intersections and were an opportunity for women to gather coins. Martina sometimes went out after she sent the children to school, returned for them once school let out, then went out again. But as the weeks passed that fall, Martina and other Rarámuri women stopped going corimiando in the mornings and instead worked on dresses. They often sewed in silence, letting the hours unfurl into long mornings and sometimes afternoons. Martina didn't plan which days she would dedicate to sewing. She didn't always calculate how much money she would lose by staying home. Instead, she simply picked up her scrap bag, a Soriana shopping bag, and either sat on her front stoop with Eugenia and Maria Jose joining her on theirs, or found a sunny spot in the clearing before the chapel. Stretching the fabric across her lap, Martina's fingers worked the needle to make it move like a snake through grass. Under and out, over and over, the needle guided brightly colored thread around the dress, stitching a sliver of blue fabric onto the path she and her family had followed out of the Sierra. Sewing their stories onto dresses was an act of resistance against cultural death. The Rarámuri women couldn't stave off hunger completely, nor could they will the men to return home. When they felt they might not be able to go and ask for korima for much longer, when they were tempted to stay home, lie down on their mattresses, leave their children to fend for themselves, they remembered their people existed outside the suffering of linear time. Now stitching paths and mountains onto their dresses, the Rarámuri women resisted falling victim to the pressures of capitalist society and instead became the makers of their own stories. They reminded themselves that even if the worst happened, even if they couldn't continue collecting coins to provide for their families, the Rarámuri story would continue. It would continue far beyond their individual lives. That month, dressmaking had become as urgent as asking for korima because it sustained their story at a time when they couldn't anticipate a return to greater stability. On the days that Martina couldn't bear to go out and ask for korima, she saved food for her children, ignored her own hunger, and sewed and sewed and sewed. So I sometimes think about the sewing circles as the practice of wasting time. And I love this because it decenters the need for production or the emphasis of production. The finishing the dress by a certain date, by a certain time, is just not something that they care about. It's about sitting in silence or with people in the sun, however you want to be sitting and whenever you want to be sitting, and sometimes especially when you have something more important to do, and making a dress. And so I love how that also aligns really perfectly with their emphasis on circular time over what I call capitalist time. And so if capitalist time emphasizes production under deadline in order to become richer, circular time embodies korima. It embodies not worrying so much about receiving, but about living in the moment and knowing that the returns are going to come, that the world is going to take care of you. And what you need to be doing at this very moment is living in peace. Now, this isn't, oh, here is a beautiful, and I wanted to include this. This is Carolina, also another photo where she's gathering skirts to bet on the race. And so I just love this photo. I wanted to share it with you. There's also, of course, something I document in the book also is that, as Emily mentioned in her introduction, there are many negotiations within the community about what it means to practice korima in the city. It's very much something that is in the process of being redefined, excuse me, in an urban context. So, you know, the sewing machines are a great example of this. We do have 5 women currently that practice, that sew on the sewing machines every day. There is a loss of the sewing circle in their lives, but for them, the gain of stable income means that their children do get to eat every day. And so for them, that negotiation has been, that trade-off has been worth it. They do still make their dresses by hand, and it's the bed sheets that they are making through the machine. And so, you know, for them, that's a choice that has been worth it. For the rest of the community, they're betraying korima, and they're pretty harshly judged for it. Another example of how korima is also is in negotiation is with the youth. So nowadays, young Rarámuri women, like these 2 women, they do wear traditional dress, but they incorporate a lot of contemporary elements of style. So you'll see a lot of the young women in the community wearing like the black winged eyeliner, hoop earrings mixed in with like handmade beaded bracelets. But, you know, they go shopping in mestizo markets and they incorporate elements of style. There's makeup, there's painted nails, there's all of that now fused together with traditional dress. And this has brought about some tensions between, you know, between generations. So a lot of the older women, for example, Paola here, she's typically more traditional and doesn't do makeup and doesn't really approve of her daughters wearing contemporary styles. She is a woman who was born deep in the Sierra and actually in a cave. She loves to tell people that she was born in a cave because she sees like our shocked faces. So she knows how to work a room. But she was born and raised in the Sierra and you know, came to the city and is a very, very strong proponent of making sure women dress as they traditionally have and not assimilating into Western dress. Now, her resistance, she's very opinionated about that, but she's actually one of the people that trains women, or has trained women to work on the sewing machines. So these negotiations are not perfect, and it's a constant source of communication and debate and controversy within the community these days, and something that I'm actively documenting each time that I go back. And so I'll leave you with a couple stories before I end. And one is that sometimes these acts of resistance, they can come with pretty strong tactics from the state to stop them. And so one example of that would be the races. I've witnessed a couple times where the women are racing in their colorful dresses. It's such a scene. And they're running through the streets. And there's so many people running that they shut down the avenues. Like cars cannot get past. There's a bunch of people in their cars who are trying to get from point A to point B, and usually they have a timeline. These women running through the streets destroy that. So there's a bunch of people who are annoyed, who are honking, who are yelling at them, who are just angry because they're going to be late for whatever they have to get to. And yet every single evening, these women shut down the streets running. Occasionally things will get so fraught with their mestizo neighbors that the police will be called. And I've witnessed this a number of times. And the police will come into the community and they will tell the women that they have to stop doing this. Like they have to stop running. They have to, they might have to pay a fine if they do it again. Sometimes they do a fine. I've not seen arrests over this, but I've heard threats of arrests. And so typically what will happen then is that the women will stop racing for a certain number of days and just kind of let things cool off. And then suddenly you'll start to see the dress pile reappear and you know that it's back on. And it's pretty fun. And so there we go again, the resistance in the face of a police mandate to stop with all kinds of threats. And here we go again. And this is something that happens not just in this community, but in the dozens of other urban communities that exist in Chihuahua City and in Ciudad Juárez, a few hours north. So sometimes that resistance can look really big. Sometimes though, I've also come to understand that korima is much smaller than that. Korima can be just the simple act of sitting in the sun on a bright afternoon when you have to be somewhere else and just letting that moment be. It can also be, as I captured here, young girls, pretty young girls who dress their little daughter, their little sister up in a child Rarámuri dress and hold her hand and just teach her to walk. I'll leave you with that. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions if you have them.
Thank you for an outstanding talk with many beautiful photos in the slides too. You told a lot of stories very well, and particularly the one with the 5 women who decided to use the sewing machines, but still manually sew their dresses. It seemed to me, even though that's kind of small factory work that I wouldn't find enjoyable, they were making a pretty good trade-off with the money that they'd be getting. And I absolutely respect these people for their culture and for them trying to keep going with it. But you mentioned that the women who were still just sewing their dresses and not working, that they weren't able to feed their children every day. And thinking about we know that malnutrition in children leads to developmental disabilities. It's just, yeah, I have that respect for them, but that kind of trade-off is a terrible decision in my mind.
I think a lot of people agree with you. 2 things. One, as an anthropologist, it can be hard for me. I'm a mother, and it can be hard for me to not come in with my own judgments and my own perceptions of people's decisions, right? But in my field work, it's extremely, extremely important that I turn that part of me off and be as non-judgmental as possible within the bounds of ethics, right? One thing I actually didn't go too deeply into is that for Rarámuri people in the city also, when they go up to women, to mestizos, and they extend their hand and they say korima, if you talk to them, they will say, well, mestizos, white people or mixed people, they have an obligation to give to us because they took our land. We live in poverty because they invaded, right? Even the mestizos, the people of mixed heritage, are seen by the Rarámuri people as betrayers. They're just the descendants of the Spaniards, really, because we've assimilated into capitalism. And so I do see that actually as another manifestation of resistance, because they resist the narrative that they're impoverished and they're making bad decisions and they're seeking alms because they refuse to do the work. They're irresponsible, and they're actually turning the narrative around and saying, no, you owe me. You owe me, and I'm going to stand here and I'm going to put my palm in front of you and I'm going to say korima to you, this ancient word that has been here for longer than you've been here, and you are going to respond.
Thank you so much for sharing this talk with us. I had a couple questions. One, and I was just curious about your relationship with, kind of how you gained entry and what type of relationship you've sustained over the years. And then I was also curious about the men, because the whole presentation's about women. You briefly mentioned women sort of thinking about how do I bring the men back. So I'm just wondering, where are they? Are they migrating? And do they also wear colorful shirts or,
Yeah.
clothes that the women sew as well?
Sure. So the first part of your question is how I gained entry into the community. The first year of my field research was really about gaining trust. They are very wary of outsiders for very good reason. El Oasis is the site of, it's a place that outsiders come in to recruit men to sell drugs. So, there's a lot of fear of the cartels in this community. It's also, I mean, it's horrific to say this, but it's also a place where people come to buy children, particularly young girls, to sell into the sex trade. And so there is, I mean, the mothers especially, it is very, very hard to gain their trust. You have to work really hard. And so I really spent my first year there just maintaining a constant presence, not having a recorder or a camera on me, not having money on me typically, because if they see cash, they tend to associate it with like the selling of people or of drugs. And so I typically would come with gifts, with food to share, and simply just maintaining a presence. Sometimes that just meant standing in the corner, standing in the background, and letting people finally get curious enough to come to me. And so that was a very long process. I think when I first got there, it took 6 weeks for somebody, I come in and I introduce myself and I was always forward, but sometimes the response, or most of the time the response I would get was this. Like, wouldn't even look me in the face, ignoring me, trying to drive me away. Rightfully so, rightfully so. And so, so I just learned at that point to just back off and, let people come to me. The children started first. And so Lupita, who is in the book, she finally just got really curious and just came up to me and was like, who are you? Like, what are you doing here? And then it went from there, and then more children, and then the mothers started to notice. And then just kind of over the years, that relationship has built. I will say that it's easier now in the last 7 or so years that people are using social media. Some of the younger women are using social media, controversial, but it's made it easier also for me to keep up through WhatsApp and through Facebook. So, and for the second part of the question, where are the men? Where are the men? They're not in the community very much during the day. So the men, this is in the book too. The women are the primary culture bearers, but it's very much worth noting that they're able to wear their dresses every day and forego stable income because the men are the ones bringing it in. The men are going out on a daily basis and getting contracted to work in construction. Not too many of them have like stable wage hour jobs like at restaurants, for example. It's mostly in construction. Many times they'll be contracted to work outside of the city, like in the ranches. There's so many ranches in the desert, and sometimes they need like a huge cattle fence that encircles like 1 million acres or something. And they'll be contracted and they'll go off for weeks to do that. Something else that happens tragically is that sometimes they'll be contracted and they'll be taken away to the mountains and they'll be forced to labor in drug fields. And so there have been some men in the community that have attempted to cross the desert and get to the United States, but not too many. They're people I think, I'm pretty sure, I haven't done as much field research with men, but I do believe that the ties to home and to the land are so strong that making that step to cross the United States is something that their particular community is not, it's behind other, like it's not doing it as much as other communities yet.
Is this like racing practice exclusive to the women in the community? And if so, how did this sort of female dominated sports practice develop?
Yeah, it's not exclusive, but because the men are out working day jobs so much, and sometimes not even in the city, they don't get to do it as much. I've observed that they do their races, and it's split between men and women. So the men race against each other, and they'll do it typically like during Holy Week when the country shuts down, or during the Christmas holiday. That's when they'll have their fun running. So really it's one of the other, like the dressmaking, it's one of the things that originated, or that is really just a focus for the women because they are in the community so much and because they don't have the pressure to bring in daily money. They have the time to waste out of, the way that they've constructed their lives in the city. But I mean, I love that you called it a sport, you said, right? Because it is. There is very much some element of competition and elements of training that go into this. And some of the best runners in the community are very revered, and they're women that are, that they run often and they train and they're building themselves up in that way. So you're right, it has definitely developed into a women's sport. Mhm.
Thank you so much for this. I'm in the very beginning, you started off with a story about korima and how it sort of circulates through the community. I'm curious if you can speak more about how that's used in terms of like creation of the garments and sourcing like materials for the garments. Is there a way that they're intentional about connecting with the land as they're creating?
So yeah, I love that question. So economics do play into this. They go to fabric stores. They go to one that's called Telas Parisinas, Parisian fabrics. It's like the Joann's fabrics of Mexico, and that is typically where they source their fabrics because that's what's available. I know that they prefer cotton because it's a little bit heavier. They like the dresses to feel heavy, so they're all made of the same kind of fabric. It's always some kind of cotton. The dress is just like they like a heavy drape. And as far as the style goes, it's mostly floral. Sometimes you'll see solid colors, but typically it will be florals because it just reminds them of the beauty of the Sierra. Even though the Sierra is semi-arid, I guess they just don't sell like cactus prints. I've never seen a cactus print in the store, So I think in their minds, they just associated the florals with the natural beauty of their home landscape. And that's the connection. A few years ago, though, I did see a really cool dress around Christmas time that was all Santa Clauses. So sometimes you'll get a little bit of a variation. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your work. My question is about writing. What I'm noticing is that you also come from a creative writing background. So how does creative writing versus anthropological or ethnological writing, like how do they kind of come together? Or are they in concert with each other? Are they in conflict at times? And how do you balance these different methods of writing?
Thank you for that. So I think that for years they were in conflict with each other for me. I started this project such a long time ago. I was an undergraduate and I hadn't gone to graduate school yet. And I had a year where I was having this identity crisis. Am I going to do the PhD in anthropology, or am I going to do the MFA in creative writing? And in my mind, it meant, am I going to write for academia, or am I going to write for trade audiences? That was my thinking back in the day. I think that has evolved a lot over the years. I did end up going the MFA route because ultimately I wanted to be able to create without too many of the structures or limitations that at the time I believed would be imposed on me in an anthropological department. Now, I don't think that that is as much the case anymore. I think now, from what I have seen, there are many anthropologists and sociologists who are writing for trade audiences, perhaps making, maybe stirring waves in their respective fields. But there is now very much a marriage of just creativity and nonfiction with rigorous academic research. To me, now, it's just a border. It's just another border, this divide between the different fields. I understand that the borders can be useful to help define what one is trying to do academically and artistically. But for me and the creation of at least this work, they weren't particularly helpful. I needed to be able to go wild on the page, as we say sometimes in arts classes, without worrying too much about, oh, is it a direct quote, or is this the right citation, or just go wild on the page and make art, and then make sure you come at it with, you know, the rigorous academic lens and work on it in that way too, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's been a process, and I think every project is different.
Maybe one more question, or okay.
Thank you, as everyone else has echoed. I, kind of similar to the fabric sourcing question, was curious about, when it comes to foodways, whether in the urban environment any sort of urban farming or gardening has been brought into that space, or if it's mostly purchasing what's affordable.
Gosh, it's, you know, I wish that there was more gardening within the community. There have been attempts, but unfortunately, the attempts are often destroyed. So there are big problems with addiction within the community, especially with girls too, but especially with young boys. And so unfortunately, you know, there's a lot of paint thinner that's sold to them. And sometimes when these young men are high, they break things, they might destroy things. And so some of the attempts at creating gardens have been just unsuccessful because people come and mess them up. And so I don't see too much of that happening. There's talks of it, like it is the dream of several of the women for the government to create an urban garden and figure out some way to protect it, because there is space. I mean, you don't need that much land or that much space, right? It doesn't take that much. And there's space within the community or just outside of the community or in the arroyo. But unfortunately, relations with the state government aren't, I mean, as with the sewing machines, the government will come in and tell the community what they need and give them what they need, instead of asking the community what it is that they want and need and then providing it. So most of the food is bought at a big box grocery store up the street, or in the little tienditas that are around, you know, that sell chips and Coke and that sort of thing.
Where's the foraging though?
Oh, that's right. I didn't talk about that. You're right. And thank you, Emily. I'm like, don't know my own work. There is a practice of foraging in the city, and I document it in the book. So sometimes in this arroyo and in other arroyos throughout the city, women in particular will go out and forage for guasoliki mainly, an edible herb that they can make like caldos, like soups from, and a few other like of those desert herbs. So there is a practice of that. It wouldn't be like a food staple, and it's not, you know, it doesn't sustain, but it is another act of resistance, going into these spaces and finding herbs.
One of my favorite parts in the book is when the government is like, we're going to take you all to a water park. And they like get all these buses for the kids and the women, and they go to this water park and they're like, what are we supposed to do here? What is happening? Why is there all this water in the desert? And then the women get so excited because they find guasulico
Yeah.
and they just like go and forage in the water park.
Oh my God, I had so much fun. It's just always hilarious when people try to do something nice for them and they're like, what? Like, what am I supposed to do with these like giant plastic tubes spewing water in the middle of the desert? And then exactly like they find all the herbs on the side of the pool and they're like, oh, they start filling shopping bags. Really fun.
Do we have time for one more, or should we? One final question. And are the books coming or? Oh, okay. Okay. So the raffle's done. One more question and then we'll do the raffle and book, whatever.
Hi, thank you very much. Is the term Tarahumara at all pejorative? And have you been to sort of rural settlements? Do they still exist? Have you done research there? 45 years ago, I was actually in Urique and Batapilos, and saw the hand-carved wooden balls that the men kick around.
Yes.
Do they still do that? And what else? Oh, and also there was a little flute that I still have actually. Did you see any music?
Yeah. So the men do run with these wooden balls. They run barefoot. Did I mention that? They run barefoot in the mountains, not as much in the cities. There's just too much glass and the asphalt is hot and everything. But the men will run kicking with their bare feet this wooden carved ball. And yes, they still do that. I have been to the Sierra. The focus of my research has been urban. I've gone with Paula, with her, back to Huachochi to visit a family or her family members that still live in a rancheria a little bit a ways from the mestizo town. I don't go back to the Sierra that often. My focus is really on urban settlements and also just kind of at this point in my life, the Sierra's contested land. It could get pretty rough there. And just the fact that I have 3 young children that need me to come home and a husband that needs me to come home is what kind of keeps me from going down to Batopilas. You said you've been, that's a town at the bottom of a canyon. And I mean, the cartel presence is just so strong there now that it's just a decision I've made for personal reasons not to go there too often. But I have been. Did I answer your whole question? Oh, yeah. No, Tarahumara is the word that the Spaniards imposed on them. I guess they couldn't roll their R's. I don't know. It's used. They'll even use it. If they introduce themselves to you, they might use they're likely to use the word Tarahumara because it's the word that most people know. But I don't think that they feel offended by it. They've come to accept it, but amongst themselves, they do typically refer to themselves as Rarámuri. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Victoria, for your talk.
Thank you.